The roads were pure ice that night, and I remember thinking the drive home from the airport would take forever. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before you even step outside. I'd been gone for 11 days visiting my father in Halifax after his hip surgery. 11 days of hospital food smells and bad coffee from the Tim Hortons across the street and sleeping on a fold-out cot in his spare room. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the flight. Thomas was supposed to pick me up at 9:15. I texted him when we landed. No reply. I texted again, waiting at the baggage carousel. Nothing. I stood outside the arrivals exit at Pearson for 23 minutes in -18, with my 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag full of my dad's old paperbacks he wanted me to take home. The sliding doors kept opening and closing behind me every time someone walked out, blasting cold air down the back of my neck. At 9:47, I called him. It went straight to voicemail. I told myself his phone died. I told myself he got stuck in traffic on the 401, and it was bad enough that he couldn't pull over. I told myself a lot of things standing there in the wind outside Terminal 1, while taxis crawled past, and other people got picked up, hugged, kissed hello. By 10:15, I stopped telling myself things and called a rideshare. The driver was a quiet man named Oluwasian, who had a pine tree air freshener and a CBC radio program playing low on the speakers. I sat in the back and watched the highway lights blur past, and I did not cry. I was too tired to cry. I just sat there with my coat pulled tight and my hands in my lap and thought about how the last time Thomas forgot to pick me up, he'd felt so terrible that he brought home flowers and made pasta from scratch, and we stayed up until 2 in the morning just talking. That was 4 years ago. We'd been married 6 months. The house was lit up when we pulled into the driveway on Martindale Crescent. Lights on in the kitchen, lights on upstairs in the bedroom. His car was there. I paid Oluwasin and dragged my bags up the front steps alone. Thomas was in the kitchen when I came through the door. He was standing at the counter eating leftover pasta straight from the container, still in his work clothes, dress shirt untucked, tie loosened. He looked up when I came in. "Hey," he said, "you make it okay?" I stood there in my coat with my 2 suitcases and a carry-on, and the cold still on my skin, and I said, "You were supposed to pick me up." He looked at his phone on the counter. He picked it up, looked at it. "Oh," he said, "I completely forgot. Sorry. Did you get an Uber?" That was it. "Oh, sorry. Did you get an Uber?" I said yes. I dragged my bags upstairs. I showered. I lay in bed next to him and stared at the ceiling and thought, something is wrong. Not just tonight. Something has been wrong for a long time, and I have been refusing to see it. I fell asleep eventually. I dreamed about my father's kitchen in Halifax, the yellow curtains, the smell of bread. The thing about noticing is that once you start, you cannot stop. Over the next 3 weeks, I started paying attention to things I had been explaining away. Thomas working late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Always those 2 days. Thomas setting his phone face down whenever he sat at the dinner table, which he'd never done before. Thomas becoming unreachable for hours at a stretch, and then reappearing with vague explanations that technically made sense, but didn't quite feel true. I was 34 years old. I managed the HR department for a mid-size logistics company in Mississauga. I was not naive. I knew what the checklist looked like. I just didn't want to be the kind of wife who went through her husband's things. But one Saturday morning in February, Thomas left his laptop open on the kitchen table when he went to get the mail. I wasn't looking for anything, I was just walking past. The screen had not gone dark yet. There was a message open on it from someone named Gwen. And in the preview, before I could look away, I read, "Can't stop thinking about Wednesday. I keep looking at my phone. I walked to the sink. I turned on the tap. I stood there running cold water over my hands for a long time, not really feeling it. When Thomas came back inside with the flyers and the electricity bill, I was making coffee. He closed the laptop without looking at me. "Want to go to Costco today?" he said. "Sure," I said. I don't know how I said it so normally. I don't know how I stood in Costco an hour later pushing a cart through the warehouse lighting and looked at Thomas comparing prices on olive oil and thought, this is the man I married. This is the man I moved cities for. I gave up a promotion in Ottawa to follow him to Toronto when his company transferred him. I've spent 8 years building a life inside this person. I bought the olive oil. I bought a 12-pack of paper towels and a rotisserie chicken and a bag of baby carrots. We drove home. I unloaded the groceries. I made dinner. That night, after Thomas fell asleep, I got up and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and called my best friend Simone. She picked up on the second ring. Simone has known me since we were roommates at Western. She does not waste time on pleasantries when she can hear from my voice that something is wrong. Tell me, she said. I told her. Everything. The airport. The phone face down at dinner. The name Gwen on the laptop screen. Simone listened without interrupting, which is one of her gifts. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You already know what this is." I said I didn't want to assume. She said, gently and firmly, the way only Simone can. "You're not assuming. You know." I am not going to tell you I handled the next few days with grace. I didn't. I went through phases. Anger so sharp it felt like something physical. Then a strange numb calm, then anger again. I went to work and sat in performance reviews and approved leave requests, and at lunch I ate alone in my car in the parking garage, because I didn't trust myself to make normal conversation. I started documenting things. Quietly. Dates, times, what he said, what his phone said the battery was at when he came home from the office at 10 p.m. I am good at documentation. It is, professionally speaking, one of my stronger skills. On the third Thursday after Costco, I told Thomas I was working late, and I sat in my car outside his office building on Bay Street and watched him walk out at 6:48 p.m. He was not alone. The woman with him was maybe 30, dark hair in a ponytail, good coat, laughing chant something. They walked to the parking garage together. He put his hand on the small of her back as they turned the corner. I sat there for a long time after they disappeared. Then I called our family lawyer, a sharp woman named Adrian, who had handled Thomas and my mortgage refinancing 2 years ago, and who I suspected was very good at other things too. I got her voicemail and left a message that said I needed a consultation about a family matter, as soon as she was available. Adrian called back the next morning. We met for coffee near her office on Queen Street West the following Monday. She had a yellow legal pad and a coffee with no sugar, and she listened the way lawyers listen, carefully, without expression, while I laid out what I knew and what I suspected. When I finished, she said, "Ontario is an equalization province. Whatever was accumulated during the marriage, you have equal claim to half, potentially more, depending on what I find." She asked if I had documentation. I handed her the folder I had prepared. She looked at me over the top of it with a slight raise of her eyebrows. "You've been thorough," she said. "I know what I'm doing," I said. I did not tell Thomas any of this. I went home that night and made chicken stir-fry and asked him how his day was. He said it was fine. He said there was a lot going on with a project. He seemed distracted. "You okay?" I said. "Just tired," he said. I nodded and passed him the soy sauce and thought, so am I. I served him the papers on a Friday morning, before he left for the office. I had stayed at Simone's apartment in the annex for the previous 10 days. Told Thomas my friend was going through something hard and needed company. He barely asked follow-up questions. He said, "That's good of you," and went back to his phone. The process server came at 7:45 a.m. Thomas was still in his dress shirt, coffee in hand, car keys on the counter. I was not there to see his face when he opened the door. But Adrian had arranged to have a letter sent simultaneously to his email and his office address, so, by the time he thought to call me, he'd already read everything. He called my cell 3 times in the first hour. I did not pick up. The 4th call, I answered. He said, "You don't have to do this. We can talk about this." I said, "Adrian is handling it from here. Please direct any communication through her office." He said my name. He said it the way he used to when we were first together. Soft, almost like a question. I said, "Goodbye, Thomas," and hung up. I sat on Simone's couch and she brought me tea, and we watched 3 episodes of a nature documentary about humpback whales, and I did not cry. I had done most of my crying alone in my car in parking garages over the past 3 weeks. I was finished with that part. What I did not expect was what happened next. Thomas, it turned out, had been hiding things. Adrian is methodical and very patient, and what she uncovered over the following 6 weeks was a picture I genuinely had not anticipated. A joint account he'd opened with Gwen. I didn't know her last name yet, still just Gwen, where money had been transferred from our joint savings account in amounts small enough not to trigger alerts. Twice. 3 times. A total of just under $14,000 over 18 months. "That's dissipation of marital assets," Adrian said in her calm, flat way. "Potentially fraud. It changes the calculation." She said it calmly. I sat in her office and looked out the window at the CN Tower, in the distance, and thought about all the grocery runs and utility bills I'd contributed to, without knowing $14,000 had been moved sideways. In Ontario, when one spouse has depleted marital assets, the court considers that in the equalization payment. Adrian said it with the measured tone of someone who has delivered this news before, and understands that it lands differently for each person who hears it. For me, it landed like a key turning in a lock. His company car, which he drove as part of his compensation package, had to be accounted for in the net family property calculation. The condo we'd bought together in 2019, which had appreciated significantly in the 4 years since, was going to be sold, and I was entitled to considerably more than half of the equity after the dissipation was factored in. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I felt tired. And then, underneath the tired, I felt something clean and clear, like air after a storm. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late May, almost 4 months after I had handed Adrian that folder of documentation. I sat in her office and signed where she indicated, and she handed me a copy in a manila envelope. The condo sold in March at a number higher than either of us expected. A couple in their 40s who had been renting in the neighborhood for years and had finally saved enough. I thought that was a good ending for the place, even if it hadn't been one for me. I had already put a deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment in a low-rise building in Leslieville. Good light, tall ceilings, a small balcony that faced east. On clear mornings, I could see the lake from the corner of it if I stood at the right angle. I called my father in Halifax after I left Adrian's office. "It's done?" he said. "It's done," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father is not an effusive man, but he is a good one," he said. "You going to be all right?" I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside Adrian's building. The afternoon was warm and the kind of overcast that turns everything soft. I thought about the fold-out cot in his spare room, the yellow curtains, the bad Tim Hortons coffee. I thought about what it had felt like to stand outside Terminal 1 in January with my suitcases in the cold. I said, "Yeah, Dad, I really think I am." The name of the colleague who handed me a coffee one Monday morning in early June and said, "Yous seem different lately." Good different was Elliot. He was not my type in the way I would have described my type if you had asked me a year ago. He was quiet and a little awkward, and he had a habit of laughing at his own jokes half a second before he finished telling them. He worked in operations and brought his lunch to work in a reusable container with his name on the lid in marker. The first time I noticed that, I laughed out loud in the break room, and he turned red and said, "It's so I know it's mine," and I said, "Elliot, we're the only 2 people in here at this hour." And he said, "Yeah, fair point," and laughed again. He asked me if I wanted to get dinner in the way someone asks when they're genuinely not sure what the answer will be. Not confident, not performing, just asking. I said yes. We went to a small Ethiopian place on Scarard Street that Elliot said he'd been meaning to try for 2 years and kept putting off. We sat across from each other for 3 hours, and the food was very good. And at some point I realized I had laughed more in that single dinner than I had in the last year of my marriage. On the walk back to the parking lot, he said, "I know you've been through a lot lately. I'm not trying to make anything complicated." I said, "I know." He said, "Okay." I said, "I had a really good time tonight." He said, "Me too," and smiled the way he smiles, like he means it, and he's also a little surprised that things turned out this well. Thomas I heard about secondhand, the way you hear about someone who used to be the center of your life and is no longer. Gwen, it turned out, had not left her existing relationship for him. She'd been in one the whole time. When that came out, things apparently ended badly between them. This I heard from a mutual friend, Craig, who ran into Thomas at a hockey game in November and texted me afterward with some hesitation. "Saw Thomas tonight. Wasn't sure if you'd want to know. He seemed not great." I thought about Thomas eating pasta from a container in the kitchen, telling me he forgot. I told Craig, "Thanks for letting me know," and put my phone away. I was sitting on my east-facing balcony when I read that text. It was cold enough to need a blanket. The lake was a dark line on the horizon, and the city was lit up, and Elliot was inside making tea because we had a rule. Whoever cooked didn't do dishes, and whoever made tea didn't have to go out on the cold balcony to look at the lake. I had cooked, so the tea was his department. He came to the door and handed me a mug and said, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking." He went back inside without asking what about, which is one of the things I have come to understand about him. He knows the difference between someone who wants to be asked and someone who just wants a moment. He gets it right almost every time. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The tea was the right temperature. The lake sat dark and still on the horizon. I thought about that night in January, the sliding airport doors, the cold on the back of my neck, the CBC program playing low on the radio in the back of the rideshare, the lights on in the kitchen when I got home, the pasta container. I thought about how I had stood there and said something is wrong, and then gone to sleep. I thought about all the parking garages. And then I thought about Simone's couch, and Adrian's yellow legal pad, and my father's voice saying, "You going to be all right," and Elliot's reusable container with his name and marker, and the Ethiopian place on Gerrard Street, and 3 hours that went by like nothing. I thought about how January felt like it belonged to someone else's life. It took losing everything I thought I was building to understand that I hadn't lost anything that was actually mine. The things that were mine, my father, Simone, the work I was good at, the person I was capable of becoming, none of that had moved. I just hadn't been paying attention to any of it. I took a sip of the tea. Elliot had left the balcony door cracked open so the warmth from inside could reach me. That was enough. That was more than enough.